Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Matthew Weinstein. I'm the State Priorities Partnership Director at Voices for Utah Children, and I'm glad to welcome you to our webinar today about deficits, budget cuts, and rainy day funds, the state of the state budget. I'm going to share my screen here so you can go through some PowerPoint slides with me. We'll take questions in the Facebook Live chat, and I'll keep an eye on those and come to those at the end. So I'm going to begin with a couple of headlines that appeared within actually 24 hours of each other back in the spring in order to put all this in context. The first headline was this one that showed up in the Deseret News on the 2nd of May that really conveys the point that things could have been quite a lot worse here in Utah. At the time, there was the possibility of $2 billion in state budget cuts. But interestingly, the day before that, in Business Week magazine, we actually saw this story saying that Utah was actually, even at that time, positioned better than any other state in the nation to weather the coronavirus pandemic and its economic effects. In particular, this chart from Business Week is looking, you can see Utah there in the lower left-hand corner of the chart, where we're experiencing, even at that time, the least job loss in the nation, and that's still the case. We also were positioned to experience the least fiscal shock in the nation as a share of our economy because of the prudence and good sense and foresight of our state's leaders, who put aside billions of dollars in reserves for just such an eventuality. And we're very fortunate that they did. So what impact did the coronavirus recession have on the state's revenues, on our tax revenues that come in, through various sources? And so I put this chart together in order to look at the main revenue sources, the general fund, and the education fund. And I'm going to start by looking at the difference between the March estimates and the June estimates. The estimates that we got in March were the basis for the budget that was originally passed in March by the legislature during the regular session, before we knew how bad things were going to get with the coronavirus or the coronavirus recession. The second set of columns, let's ignore the far right column for the moment, because that's sort of a moving target. It's the actual revenue that we don't have final numbers for. But by June, a few months later, it was a very different picture. So starting out looking at the general fund, which is mostly from the sales tax, and here we're looking just at the unrestricted portion, not the earmarked portion of the general fund, of the sales tax rather, that gets diverted to the transportation fund. We're looking here at the portion of the sales tax that goes into the general fund. As you can see, didn't really take a big hit, which was interesting and surprised a lot of people. And the main explanation for that was that consumer spending stayed strong in the early months of the pandemic and the recession because of all the federal aid. At the end of March, the federal government passed trillions of dollars in aid, such as the expanded unemployment benefits, the tax refund payments of $1,200 per adult, $500 per child, that most Utahns were able to receive. We know, of course, that not all Utahns received these. We know that about 100,000, for example, undocumented Utahns were not eligible for those payments and have had to struggle through without them. but most Utahns did get them. It was a big boost for the state's consumer economy. But with the income tax, it was a different story. And the income tax did take a big hit, although not just because of the recession, also because the income tax filing deadline got moved by the federal government from April 15th to July 15th. And you may notice that that actually puts it in the wrong fiscal year. We're counting on that revenue for FY20, which ended on June 30th of 2020. The new fiscal year began July 1st, FY21, that will end on June 30th of 2021. And that created a problem for the state over and above the problem of the revenue lost because of people losing their jobs and having their incomes cut. So in order to see the difference, if you look down at the bottom here, if you combine that, the 2 years together, is where you can really see the size of the hit. Back in March, we thought we were going to have $16.4 billion between those two main funds for the state budget. But we ended up by June seeing that we were going to take about an $850 million hit between the 2 years. And that certainly creates a challenge that the state had a number of ways to respond to that are listed here on this slide. The bonding and the rainy day funds is something that actually was presented in detail at the May meeting of the Executive Appropriations Committee. They went through a pandemic stress testing document that laid out that the state is in good shape for this sort of crisis, with $5.4 billion in reserves in 4 different categories. That you can click on that link. I'll post that in the chat later on, and can check out that document for yourself. But basically the state was in pretty good shape, although it was clear at that point that the state legislature staff, you can see this in the lower right-hand corner here, felt pretty strongly that they really didn't want the legislature to be using the rainy day funds, and that was something that they felt should be saved for later, saved for a later point in the pandemic and in the recession. There was federal aid, as I've mentioned, and a huge amount of federal aid that came from the various actions taken by the federal government in March. But interestingly enough, and this is a big difference from the Great Recession back in 2009, when there was a big federal response then as well, the federal government did not allow the states to use the aid that they were getting to close their deficit, to backfill for lost revenue because of the recession. They said it could only be used for spending related to the pandemic. And so that's an important difference. We couldn't really count on that. And then the other 2 main options are the budget cut option, which got going in May, where the Executive Appropriations Committee met in May and gave direction to all the appropriations subcommittees in the legislature to come up with lists of budget cuts for a June special session. Of course, the last option is always revenue enhancements, which raises the big debate about what's going to do more economic harm in a recession and when you're recovering from the recession. Is it better to be cutting public budgets, which means potentially hundreds or thousands of layoffs, which can deepen the recession and slow the recovery? Or is it better to raise taxes, which then gets into the question of whose taxes do you raise? Are you raising taxes on business or on individuals, on low-income individuals or middle-income individuals or high-income individuals? Is it income taxes or sales taxes or property taxes, state versus local? So lots of questions there that, as it turns out, this was the question of potentially revenue enhancement was not one that was high on the legislative agenda. And so at the May meeting of the EAC, the Executive Appropriations Committee, they actually set the stage. They laid out what their plan was going to be. If you follow this chart here from left to right, from one of the documents that was handed out in May, they talked about how first they were going to address the temporal balance and the cash flow issue created by the moving of the filing deadline for income tax from April 15th to July 15th, from FY20 to FY21. Then they were going to look at spending reductions and the use of what are referred to as working rainy day funds, which I'll come back to in a minute, and operating reserves. And the last options that the legislature wanted to look at were revenue enhancements, also known as tax increases, and the use of budgetary reserves, or the official rainy day funds was the lowest on their priority list. So the first actions that they took were in May, were addressing the cash flow management and actually doing something very interesting, which honestly I did not know you could do. They moved $770 million of the appropriations for fiscal year 20 into the fiscal year 21 budget. Seems simple and elegant enough in order to ensure that those appropriations would be in the fiscal year when the revenue would be coming in because of the tax deadline being moved from April to July, from FY20 to FY21, as it turned out. And then they also, in House Bill 3001, accessed what they referred to as the working rainy day funds, which is kind of code for bonding. Utah has an excellent bond rating. We have a triple. We're rated AAA by all three of the bond rating agencies. One of the few states to enjoy that distinction of fiscal health. And so we're in a position, in a situation like this, to convert cash financed capital expenditures into bond financed capital expenditures. So buildings that were going to be built, like the new prison was one of the big ones that was targeted. And another one, transportation projects, transportation infrastructure investment. So $350 million in bonding for prison construction, $177 million in bonding for transportation projects that were, for which the state sold bonds in order to add to the cash flow position of the state. And that was in the month of May. In the month of June, the legislature met again in a special session to do budget cutting. And this is in Senate Bill 5001. And the state carried out, the legislature decided on $870 million of budget cuts from the FY21 budget that they had passed back in March. And that included $141 million cut from the education budget and from the record increase that had been planned back in March for a 6% WPU increase. To their credit, they did preserve the portion of that increase that covered inflation and growth in enrollment. But we missed the opportunity as a result of that to make real improvement on a per pupil, per student basis. The optional extended day kindergarten expansion was cut in half by $5 million. Our pre-K program was cut by $3 million. Early literacy professional development for Utah teachers was cut by $5 million. Some smaller cuts, such as $500,000 from the Grand Families program. We also lost the 12-month continuous insurance coverage for the youngest children on Medicaid That was canceled. Millions were cut from public health care clinics that help refugees and underinsured Utahns get the care they need. That forced most of those clinics to shut down, which seemed to be a very difficult thing to justify, in our view, in the middle of a recession and a pandemic. Also, the biggest cut went to what are referred to as pay-go buildings. That's state building construction projects that were going to be funded with cash. And these cuts, however, it's important to note, were not replaced with bonding, at least not yet. And that also has a negative economic impact, some of which, of course, is unavoidable in this sort of situation, because these are construction jobs, good-paying construction jobs that now are not there. And the salary increase for state employees was also nixed. Now, I also want to highlight something else that was included in Senate Bill 5001. It included something that actually surprised us a little bit, this unexpected contingent appropriation of $100 million from the state's official rainy day funds. As I noted a moment ago, the legislature had said in May that using the official rainy day funds was the last thing they wanted to do, but the truth is they were up against a bit of a public outcry over that. A lot of people saying, it's raining out there. We're in a recession. Now's the time to break into the piggy bank a little bit. We had about $800 million available in those official rainy day funds. And so the legislature did announce that week in June that they were going to make $100 million available from those official rainy day funds, $70 million from the education budget reserve account, $30 million from the general fund budget reserve account, which we were very pleased to hear and very much appreciated. And then came the August special session 2 months later, where we actually were surprised again because we began to hear that the legislative leadership had decided not to use the contingent appropriation of $100 million from the official rainy day funds. Now, nothing was announced publicly, but if those funds had been used, it would have made it possible, given that Utah's economy was doing better than any other states, it would have made it possible to restore a substantial portion of those June budget cuts. We registered the lowest unemployment rate in the nation in July, still much higher than we'd like it to be at 4.5%, but best in the nation. And then at the bottom here, there were some positive actions taken. There were some funds found to restore a few of the cuts, including allowing one of those public health clinics to stay open for another 6 months. Unfortunately, it was too late for the other two. And also to restore funding to some K through 12 programs, which is something we very much appreciated. And then this week, we didn't have a special session of the legislature, but we did have the September meetings of the legislative committees, including the Executive Appropriations Committee. The Executive Appropriations Committee met on Tuesday, and we did actually get a public announcement this month from the legislative staff where they said that they're not intending to use the rainy day funds, the $100 million contingent appropriation. Unfortunately, would probably make it impossible to restore any of the budget cuts that we had from June. And it would be, you know, again, they said this isn't yet a final decision. They're waiting for the final numbers to come in from the tax commission. But it would really be a disappointment. Thousands of Utahns wrote to legislators in June saying that the rainy day fund should be used to avoid damaging budget cuts. Unfortunately, in the middle of a recession, especially a recession caused by a pandemic, budget cuts at the state level just mean a deeper recession, a slower recovery, additional job losses, and they disproportionately harm the most vulnerable Utahns, low-income Utahns, minorities, rural Utahns. I think it would also come as a real disappointment to a lot of legislators to learn that that decision was made. Folks who follow this closely may have followed back on June 1st at the Public Ed Appropriations Subcommittee. They actually had a 45-minute-long debate about the use of rainy day funds. The vice chair, one of the vice chairs of the committee, Representative Waldrop, proposed a resolution to get people on the record saying that rainy day funds should be given very serious consideration for the June special session. And they debated that for 45 minutes before supporting it. And we saw a couple of days later in the special session that, in fact, they did include $100 million, although, as we learned on Tuesday of this week, it sounds like they, in the end, are not going to use it. Also, at the Executive Appropriations Committee this week, there was an interesting document. This is something actually that was prepared at the request of Voices for Utah Children and was then presented to the Executive Appropriations Committee by the legislative staff because we found it so hard, to be honest, to understand what was done in June. We said to the legislative staff, can you put it on one page? Can you come up with a simple explanation of exactly everything that happened? There's so many moving parts and the numbers don't add up the way you would think they would because of the way that recession budgeting works, which is something that the experts at the Legislative Fiscal Analyst's Office were very kind and accommodated the request, and then presented it also this week to the Executive Appropriations Committee. And you can see in the lower right corner, sort of the bottom line, that we ended up with $858 million of budget cuts coming out of this, and used $680 million of budget reserves, although you have to point out that that includes the $100 million that they now say they're not going to use to restore those June budget cuts. And so we're left with mainly use of bonding and canceling of cash funded capital projects. So what's next? There are three issues that I wanted to highlight as we move toward closing here. And the first one is the question of, is there going to be an opportunity to restore these budget cuts that were made in June, these hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts at this time of pandemic and recession? Is there going to be any opportunity to restore those in education, in public health, the cost of living increases, the capital projects, which then leads to the next question about bonding. Actually, it was back in May when the Deseret News reported that the legislature was already at that point giving serious consideration to the question of bonding. Should the state use any of its $3 billion of bonding capacity that has been untapped at this point? That's about half of the bonding capacity overall. Should we use that to help the economy? We did that in the last recession, during the Great Recession. And will we do that now? And no decision has been made about that yet. But it's something to keep an eye on for the future. And then another issue that is going to be important to keep an eye on in the CARES Act, which was the major federal relief legislation passed at the end of March, they included an Easter egg for the highest income Americans and the highest income Utahns, this tax giveaway reopening, ironically, one of the loopholes that had just been closed 2.5 years earlier. At the end of 2017, the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was passed by Congress that was a big business tax cut, but it also closed to its credit a number of loopholes that have been available to high-income individuals and to businesses. Unfortunately, in the CARES Act, somebody snuck in at the last minute, reopening one of those that's related to, as it says here, how extensively pass-through corporations can apply business losses to the owner's individual tax return. And the thing here is that, you know, at the federal level, they can do this and I guess not have to worry about it because they can just borrow money and run up a higher debt in order to pay for it. But we can't do that at the state level. If this ends up causing revenue losses for Utah, which is what we expect, we'll just have to cut the education budget or the public health budget or capital budgets or infrastructure or other important investments for Utah's future. And a number of states have already decoupled from this. Doesn't seem to be any pattern as far as red versus blue. It's states across the political spectrum and across the country that are starting to decouple from this. You can see here from this chart that some of the states for which we have numbers, they were expecting huge revenue losses, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars if they didn't decouple. And so this is something we're going to be bringing before the legislature as well, and urging that at the very least we begin by getting these numbers and finding out if this is something where Utah will be impacted. Okay, I'm looking to the chat here to see if we have any questions. I'm not seeing any at the moment. So what I'll say is, if you have questions about this, we're going to post the slideshow and the video in various places on our Facebook page and in the on YouTube, on our YouTube page, and I'll post a link to this slideshow as well. And if questions come up, you know, post them there. Feel free to email me, Matthew, M-A-T-T-H-E-W, utahchildren.org, and I'll be happy to respond, get back to folks, address any questions that come up. So I'll just say in closing, thank you to everyone. Thanks to the thousands of Utahns who've been, you know, following this with us and who've been weighing in with your legislators, letting them know how important the state budget is to so many Utahns' lives, whether it's about education or public health or the other things that we rely on state government to deliver for us. We appreciate your following this with us. We appreciate your support and involvement, and we'll look forward to continuing to stay on top of this in the months to come.